Well, guys, today I'd like to get into the subject I've been trying to put off for such a long time. But you've been such wonderful people. I haven't had really one single negative report. Well, there's been one exception, but it had nothing to do with the show. It was merely a personal matter. The guy didn't like me for some reason, and that's okay. Um, and before I start, there are a couple of things I want to ask you. Don't think I'm being impolite or that I'm not answering any of your invites for friends or anything of that nature, or that I don't respond necessarily when you subscribe. You know, to me, this is very much of a sideline, and I have so many other things on my plate. I don't get to do this very often, but I do not even know what this friend invitation means. I have subscribers, and I am subscribing to some, and I thought that's it. So if you could enlighten me and tell me a little bit about what this friendship really means, what do we do that we wouldn't otherwise do? So that's really all I'm asking, and if you could tell me, I would really appreciate it. Now, as for the next episode, this has to be the military service in Germany during World War II. I told you I was in the labor service, and I had finished my assignment in the labor service. For a very brief period of time, I went home, and the time came where I had to join up. Now, I volunteered, no question about it, and there were several reasons. Number one, of course, it was a tradition in our family. And unfortunately, even though we certainly did not agree with Hitler and were very much opposed to him, the military is a totally different animal at that time, and the military is a unit within the bigger one. So the other thing, though, was that if you did not volunteer, you were going to be drafted, and if you were drafted, you would end up in the infantry. And now, since walking has never been my strong point, and I've never been crazy about it, and since I always liked machinery, I wanted to be a fighter pilot, of course. My father was a flyer during World War I, and you know, with those paper kites, that was really something. And I could someday tell you about that. There's some interesting stories that go with that. But of course, I wanted to be an officer, and I signed up as an officer's candidate. And I now needed to sign up at a proper regiment. So, like we do today with our college kids, Dad takes me by the hand, gets on the train, and we go to different outfits and we check them out. Of course, we had already pre-checked them, and we knew pretty much what we were looking for. I'd been turned down by the Air Force. I couldn't fly because of my eyesight. It wasn't 100%, and at that time, glasses were totally out of the question. And so that was out. And I didn't want to be a mechanic for the airplanes, so next thing I wanted to do is go into tanks. Now, tanks were the continuation of cavalry. Now, cavalry would not have appealed to me at all. But tanks, motorized vehicles, now that's another story. And we decided that's where I wanted to go. So my dad took me to a couple of outfits, regiments, and we ended up at Panzer V in Neuruppin, which is near Berlin. And after I'd been signed up, I said goodbye to my dad, and I had to say goodbye to my grandpa. Now, my grandfather lived in a very large house, about 50 rooms, and he was there all by himself with his servants. And every Sunday we had sort of a command performance. We went to his house, and we had mocha, which is coffee in very thin cups, and you sat in the big hall. And that was about my experience with my grandfather. He was not, he was fine. I liked him a lot, but he was not a very warm person. We certainly can't compare him to Peter. When it came time for me to go and join the forces, the war was almost over. I mean, this was in November of 1944. In May 45, the war was over, and it was clear at that time that we weren't going to win it. So my grandfather takes me aside and tells me, look, son, I want you to conduct yourself with honor. If you bring dishonor to the family, I would rather see you dead than cross this threshold. And then he shook my hand. That was more warmth than I had experienced from him ever, and said goodbye to me. And you know, funny thing was, at the time I felt that was a very proper thing to do. And today it gives you the creeps, but at the time I felt, yeah, that's what I would do with my son. Now my father was very different. My father was a military man too, but it was reserve. So was my grandfather, for that matter. My grandfather was a major, my father was a captain, but it was a reserve officer, and it was just determined that we had to be officers and we had to conduct ourselves properly, and then we would come back and we would take care of the farms. So my dad, he must have felt terrible. I mean, when you see a 17-year-old, your only son, go to the front and the war is lost, and you know that the enemy has such superior strength and equipment, and the Americans are not being disturbed in their own country. They can produce from morning till night, while we had to duck every time a plane appeared, and it was getting terrible. So to him this must have been a terrible thing to do. But he said goodbye to me and at the railway station, and that was the last I saw of him for a long time. Now I arrived in Neuruppin, and I must say that I was, I can't say that I was against the military, not at all. I was very much for it. I didn't like Hitler, but you don't have to like Hitler to still have to go with the military. If a soldier in Iraq right now doesn't like Bush, and I bet you that 90% of them don't, they still have to fight on. There is just no way. This is what your job is all about, unfortunately, and the officers must have felt very much the same. But you know what happens to generals who don't agree with Hitler? They were just phased out, and somebody else was brought in who would be more in line with his thinking. In other words, Hitler made the decisions. He was the decider. And if people didn't agree with him, and that included generals, they would just be sidetracked, if they were lucky. Well, anyway, I arrived in Neuruppin and got my hair cut short. I had nice long locks. I lost them the first day. And then we were in for basic training. Basic training being, well, you know, boot camp. It's no fun, but you got to get it over with, and then once it's over and done with, you're part of the crew and everything is fine. We had a sergeant who was particularly nasty. He had been very badly injured. He had burn marks all over his face, and he has lost one arm. He was teaching us the ins and outs, and he was trying to get us to be a little less relaxed and realize that war isn't all fun and games, and that all that propaganda that we had heard in the past is a lot of baloney. So he was a little crass about it because, for instance, he would tell us, look, when you jump in the tank, it's an enclosed unit. Inside is very noisy, and when the gun goes off, inside the noise is almost unbearable. And he explained a situation that he had encountered in Africa, where, no, in Russia, where they were pushed back. They had abandoned one of the tanks with their dead inside. And 4 days later, they retook this particular area, and they got the tank back. And he said, we had to get those people out. Well, you know, they're stiff as a board, so I went in with an axe and, you know, this kind of stuff, which really scared the dickens out of us. Then they issued us the dog tags, and our dog tags came with a chain rather than the string, which would normally be issued. And explanation was, well, you know, when you're in tanks and there's a fire and it burns, we want to make sure we can still find your dog tag around you. Well, you know, we were starting to get second thoughts about this whole hero business. Well, anyway, the service in Neuruppin was the initial basic training. After that, we got into, oh, wait a minute, we're at 9 minutes already. God, I can't do anything. We continued our basic training in Denmark. Denmark was a country occupied by us. And it was a very friendly occupation, really. I mean, sure, there were resistance fighters, and but I think the king of Denmark realized that there was no point in making a big stink and getting the Germans all upset, so they kind of played it down. But occasionally the Brits would drop infiltrators, and they would resupply these well, you would call them terrorists today, and I think if you're on the other side, you call them freedom fighters. And if you want a neutral term, they were resistance fighters, and they would replenish their supplies. And that was the only problem we had to watch out for. The Danes were very reserved, didn't like us, but didn't show it in any negative way. We were young kids, and we were being trained. And when we had a few minutes off, we would go out on the town. The town was very well stocked in contrast to Germany. They had goods that we hadn't seen for years. Their restaurants and their food was excellent. Their restaurants were full. And we were being paid less because they wanted us to spend our money on food in Denmark, which we did. So we went to restaurants and we ate there occasionally, and we were being served like everybody else, and there was no problem. We were very quiet, well behaved, because our commanding officer was a real stickler for the rules. Well, I can give you one little example. My best friend really at the time, Mully, and one other guy with him. We always had to go out in twos. We never had to were allowed to go out alone. I went to a little store, and in the store they sold ties, men's ties. And Molly saw a tie that had a naked girl on it, and of course, I mean, he flipped this. He had to have this tie, no two ways about it. Naturally, he had no way of wearing it, but he figured someday he'll have a chance. So he talked to the guy, and he said, how much for the tie? And the guy said, let's say the equivalent of $5. No, it was worth about that, maximum, and it was about $1.50. And the guy said $20, and Molly said, you're nuts, I mean, $20, that's outrageous. Well, he said, take it or leave it, it's $20. So it had been marked at $2.95 or something like that. So Molly figured he was being taken advantage of course he was. And so he gave the guy $5, took the tie, and left. Well, he hadn't even gotten home yet, and by the time he got back, they waited for him, and they told him that he had to put his best uniform on, had to be excused from the service temporarily from the sergeant, and had to appear at the commander's office. Well, Mully didn't know what this was all about, so he did that. He put on his white belt and all that fancy uniform bit, and he goes in and wants to see the commanding officer. Well, in the anteroom, the girl tells him, no, you got to sit down and wait for him. The sergeant will come also. And so he waited. About 10 minutes later, his sergeant came in and sat there as well, and then the two of them were led into the commander's office, a colonel. And the colonel started right in on Molly and said, soldier, I understand you stole something. And Molly said, sir, no, I don't think so. What did I steal? You said a tie. No, he said, I paid for it. Well, what did you pay? Well, I paid $5. How much was it worth? $2.95. What did the guy want for it? $20. Well, the colonel said a little sarcastically, he said, did the guy force you to take this tie? And Molly stuttered, no, sir, he didn't. Well, he said, I'll tell you what, we're in boot camp right now, so to give you a week in a cooler doesn't make too much sense. We can do better out in the field. But I want the sergeant here to go with you to the merchant. You're going to make a restitution, and you're going to make an apology. And then I want the sergeant to report back to me. Dismissed. So Molly left, and I talked to Molly later, and I said, you know, Molly, that's really the proper way to handle this, don't you think? And he fully agreed with me. He said, I was a damn fool. I shouldn't have done this. I had no business doing this, and I had it coming. So it was that kind of an atmosphere. Christmas time came around, and on Christmas Eve, they were looking for volunteers to do the patrolling in town. We had to patrol and look for anything suspicious happening. Well, a buddy and I went, I volunteered for that because I didn't want the Christmas party. There was too much of that one candle for Hermann Goering and one candle for Adolf Hitler and all that kind of stuff. And this really didn't appeal to me too much. I was surprised that our unit did this, but we had a political officer in there as well, and he was sort of a monitor, and he is the one that came up with a brilliant idea. So I volunteered for this, and my friend and I walked around, and it was kind of sad, and every house we walked by, there were Christmas songs, and there were good smells, and we were out there, and we knew we weren't being wanted, and there wasn't a single person who came out and offered us something, not that we could have taken it, but anyway. And we just walked around and came back. We were a little depressed. Well, I think for now I will stop. I will show you a couple of things. One thing I want to show you is a picture of my grandfather, grandmother, and the three sons and one daughter at the very beginning of World War I. Now, this is not World War II that I was in, but this is World War I. But it's to paint and give you an idea of the military background and the upbringing that had something to do with our attitude. And it may be difficult for you to understand because it's so different here. But at a later segment, I will get into details. And then maybe I will close out with our well, you know, in schools here you have a school song, and in the military you had your song as well. And this is one that the Panzers had. I'll play you a few bars of that just to give you a little bit of the atmosphere. Please don't construe this as any pro-war or pro-Hitler or anything. Don't start in on this. It's not the case, and you guys have been absolutely wonderful. I can't complain. You've handled this beautifully. I never thought I'd get this far without getting shut down somehow. So for now, let me just stop this. I will show you the picture, and the picture will show my grandfather and grandmother, he in a uniform as a major in World War I, and the sons. Now the one sitting is the oldest son who died during that war. He was shot by a sniper and lost his eyesight completely. He was shot in the head and both eyes went. And then a year later or so he died of influenza. The other two, the one on the left is the youngest son, Manfred. Then comes the sister, and then comes my dad. And my dad looks very uncomfortable. He had to start out in an artillery regiment with horses. He hated horses with a passion, just like I do. And he then eventually transferred to the Air Corps. But it just gives you a little bit of atmosphere. So let's say goodbye for now, and give me a feedback, especially on this friend business. I don't want to be a coarse, unmannered person, so help me out on this, will you?